Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 22 of season 1 of Babylon 5, Chrysalis. In the advisory council, we learn that Narn ships have apparently engaged Centauri ships along the border of their territory near Quadrant 37. There's a Narn military base in the area. Malari says it's neutral territory per treaty, but Jakar says the treaty was signed under duress, so it's no treaty at all. He says patrols are needed for non-planetary security. And they're just going round in circles, and he leaves the room. Interestingly, Kosh is present, which is unusual for him. On the Zocalo, a man named Petrov lurches towards Garibaldi, who knows him, saying they're going to kill someone. He passes out from his wound before he can say more. Garibaldi explains in MedLab that he ran into Petrov some months ago, but that he wasn't a bad guy, he'd just fallen in with the wrong crowd. He's basically been working for Garibaldi ever since. Franklin is unable to save him. Garibaldi is genuinely concerned, realising that Petrov dragged himself a long way in great pain to pass on his message. Garibaldi is determined to dig deeper. Catherine Sakai is staying with Sinclair again as the ISN reports on a 5-planet goodwill tour the President has embarked on Earth Force One, to culminate in a speech at the jump point off Io to signal his intentions for the rest of his 5-year term, which he won a few episodes ago. Sinclair reminisces a touch about their relationship, before proposing in a rather bizarre way, which still gets accepted. Malari reckons about 50 Centauri gods since the last Emperor was elevated to godhood, and he wonders how many he's offended to end up with Jakar's teeth buried in his neck. And even worse, his government is planning to give Quadrant 37 to the Narn. He concludes it's like being nibbled to death by cats, except he was actually describing ducks. Close. Just then, Mr. Morden calls for the ambassador, and he agrees to meet him in an hour. In Delenne's quarters, we see her working on the structure she has been building in her quarters for some time. Lanier returns, having asked Kosh a very specific question, to which the answer was yes. Delenne tells Lanier to wait for her and leaves her quarters. Garibaldi has gone to down below. Nice establishing shot of a monorail car going over the top of the corridor. He gets very few answers as the inhabitants make themselves scarce, until one calls him into what might be called a tent. The man knew Petrov and liked him. He tells Garibaldi that he and Petrov were hired by a man to move some cargo, and it had to be illegitimate cargo, otherwise they wouldn't have been using lurkers to move it. And something about it scared Petrov, sent him to Garibaldi. He gives Garibaldi a name, Devereaux, who can be found in the casino. Awesome. They put a maze in what Morden referred to as the park. Lovely establishing shot. You can see the end cap of the station and the support struts. Note that Londo is choosing to keep Veer in the dark about Mr. Morden, who he finds and finally thanks for the rescue of the eye in Signs and Portents. Morden explains that he is there to be of service and to elevate Londo out of obscurity, while Londo seems to have accepted his place in the world. Mr. Morden explains that he and his associates can deal with Londo's Quadrant 37 problem, and suggests Londo tell his government that he is going to deal with the problem. Mr. Morden wants no credit, but yes, there is a price, a vague request for a favour of some kind in the future. Londo is used to extracting a price for such favours himself, of course, and dealing with a fortified non-military base is clearly no small matter. Whilst he doesn't quite believe it's going to happen, realisation of what's being set in motion is starting to dawn on him. Delenne goes to see Kosh and asks to see it with her own eyes before she fulfills her promise. Kosh's encounter suit begins to open, and Delenne's face is lit by a light, and there is a sound of billowing sheets. She smiles and says she will now keep the promise, and that he will not see her again as she is now. New Year's Eve, 2258. Garibaldi finds Mr. Devereaux and a couple of his associates, who are not at all keen on accompanying him to the station to look at pictures of lurkers. Garibaldi insists. Londo tells Veer to relay Morden's suggested message to Homeworld, reassuring him he has not been drinking. Sinclair goes to see Natoth, who says Jakar is fatigued, up until 3 Earth girls leave his chambers. Seems his schedule just opened up. Sinclair quietly but firmly accuses him of being like an abused child who's grown big enough to start abusing others. He wants the Narn to ease off on the Centauri and not let their anger consume them. Impressive chess piece prosthetic on Chrysalis in this scene. Sinclair and Sakai ask Garibaldi and Susan to be best man and maid of honour at their nuptials. Garibaldi's happiness for them is interrupted by his link telling him Devereaux and his henchmen have gone missing from security. Garibaldi knew something was up because Devereaux's PPG didn't have a serial number. The coil is diamond hard, so they can't be removed, therefore his PPG never had one, which means this guy is Earth Force intelligence, but he's not on file. At Quadrant 37, a Narn fighter patrols the perimeter of the base when he loses comms and looks out of his canopy aghast as something shimmers into existence. His own existence ends shortly thereafter as another shadow vessel joins what is a slaughter rather than a battle. They appear identical to the ship we saw in Signs and Portents. They eliminate immense capital ships and fighters alike with their purple beam weapons, then perform surgical strikes on ground targets from orbit before fading out. In C&C, all is quiet, Ivanova manning the night shift. ISN reports that Vice President Clark has left Earth Force One for tests owing to a viral infection, whilst the ship continues to Jupiter. He intends to catch up as the tour returns from Io. Garibaldi is checking crates in the loading bay as another security officer arrives his aid. What he discovers is what Petrov was loading. One crate didn't make it out. Not medical supplies, but static transmitters and a triangulation device for optimum placement, with coordinates set for near Io. The frequency on the transmitters is set for Gold Channel, Earth Force One's frequency. Garibaldi puts 2 and 2 together and calls Sinclair for an ultraviolet priority meeting in 20 minutes. He can't tell him more of the link. Garibaldi doesn't see the other security officer he was speaking with, who was being less than helpful, making a call identifying himself as Blue Alpha. Garibaldi is on his way when he encounters Devereaux and draws his PPG. He tells him to get up against the wall with his henchmen and is shot in the back by Blue Alpha. He goes down hard and his link and PPG are removed. Sinclair is looking for him, of course, as is Ivanova. Delenn arrives at his quarters and floors him by showing him the triluminary, the same device that he saw on board the Minbari cruiser during the Battle of the Line. He acknowledges that he recognises it, which Delenn already suspected. She wants to tell him more, and has taken a risk in coming to him, endangering them both, but he explains that Garibaldi is missing, and she understands. She tells him to come and see her, but not be too long, as certain things have been set in motion. We see that Garibaldi is down but not out, and is hauling himself towards a travel tube inch by inch. Natoth breaks the news about Quadrant 37 to Jakar. Every building, gone. 3 heavy cruisers in near orbit, gone. Fighters, gone. No records, no survivors. 10,000 warriors lost. Jakar eliminates Earth and the Minbari as suspects, believes the Centauri don't have the will, and the non-aligned worlds are not powerful enough for such a comprehensive assault, and the Vorlons just don't care. He concludes that there is someone else out there. Garibaldi has made the lift, barely, and 2 revellers find him as they try and leave the New Year's Eve party on the Zocalo. Lennier asks Delenn if she's sure about what she's doing, and she asks him how can she stand in the way of prophecy, that Valen said this day would come. She places the triluminary atop the structure she has created, and begins glowing and creating threads across the room. She hopes that Sinclair is going to hurry. Garibaldi is brought into Medlab in bad shape, but seeing through the pain, he delivers his message to Sinclair. They're going to kill the President off the jump point at Io. Hence the need for jammers set to Earth Force One's frequency. As Sinclair arrives at C&C, it's apparent that the jammers are already active. Earth Force One is unreachable by military channels, and ISN is reporting that the President hasn't started a planned speech on time as his ship moves towards the station in orbit of Io. The bridge crew assembles to watch ISN while they try to get through on civilian channels. Just like that, Earth Force One is gone. An explosion in its engines, sending it tumbling before exploding completely. C&C is left in shock. Unfortunately, Sinclair has assigned the traitor to both watch Garibaldi's back and hunt down Devereaux. Ivanova, Jakar and Natoth commiserate each other and hope for justice for what has happened on this dark day. The Narns will seek retribution when they find out who has acted, and Jakar hopes Earth will find those responsible for its own loss. We see Lennier shedding a tear and hear a faint whimper from Delenn, who we do not see. Londo meets with Morden, shocked by what has happened, while Morden is blasé, saying he didn't think Londo would care if it was 100,000 or 1,000,000 Narn who died. The point is, Londo's name is now being mentioned in the royal court. He has been noticed. He's a hero. Problem solved, without starting a war. Morden tells him to enjoy it. Londo is left to contemplate his new status, alone in the park. Sinclair is issued with a gag order by a senator who is claiming a problem with Earth Force One's fusion reactor caused the incident, despite Sinclair's evidence to the contrary. She doesn't want to listen. Garibaldi's friend's been busy, claiming he shot Devereaux and his colleagues in self-defense when he found them and they went for him. But as another officer notes, Devereaux's PPG is cold. It hasn't been fired recently. He realises it would be unwise to push it further, noting that PPGs do cool down pretty quickly, which he clearly doesn't believe. Garibaldi's operation is going to begin as they have him somewhat more stable. Vice President Morgan Clark is now going to be sworn in following the death of Luis Santiago. We see him being sworn in, and he gives an ISN statement suggesting he will not be as outward looking as his predecessor. Sinclair is sitting at the bar watching this and contemplating the day's events when Kosh appears behind him. He intones, "And so it begins." He then adds, "You have forgotten something." Sinclair looks puzzled, then exclaims, "Delenn!" and sets off at a run. Lennier tells him he's too late when he arrives in her quarters. There is a structure on the wall of her quarters that Lennier identifies as a chrysalis. He says she's changing, but into what, Lennier doesn't know. We can just make out her face through the threads of the organic structure. Natoth is looking for Jakar, but on arriving to his quarters her voice triggers a recorded message. He has returned to their homeworld and will be out of touch for an indeterminate period. He says Sinclair was right, they were at a crossroads, and they have now chosen a path. He tells her to expect him when she sees him. Londo comes to Medlab and asks to wait with Ivanova, saying that Mr. Garibaldi is an annoying man, but that he would miss him if he passed. The operation is taking longer than anticipated, and the traitor watches on as well. We see Mr. Morden discussing Malari with his associates, who we can barely make out, saying he's ready and will be perfect for their needs. Sinclair says nothing's the same anymore as Sakai comes to sit with him. The episode closes on Lennier, sitting in a candlelit vigil over Delenn's chrysalis. Yes, it's a lot, isn't it? The end of the beginning. This is, of course, an arc episode, pulling together many threads, whilst not massively resolving many of the storylines. League of Non-Aligned Worlds aside, every major power is engaged in this episode in some way, so let's break it down by species. Highs and lows for the humans tying into the Narn and Minbari. Sinclair gets engaged, seemingly finally cementing his relationship with Sakai, yet he also suffers the shock of Garibaldi's disappearance and critical wounding, Delenn's revelations about the Battle of the Line, and their collective failure to save the President, who was a great supporter of the station. Garibaldi loses an ally, and finally comes up against the enemy within, who he literally doesn't see coming. Now there's a Viper in their midst, looking to finish the job. We see him fight against all odds to give himself and the President a chance at life. At the end of the episode, his still hangs in the balance. The President is gone, long live the President. The President who got off Earth Force One just before it was destroyed. Lucky man. Lucky Earth Alliance? Remains to be seen. Delenn reaches a crossroads and chooses to follow prophecy and fulfill a promise. She dares to reach out to Sinclair, knowing in doing so she endangers them both. Yet he fails to get back to her in time, and so having visited and seen Kosh, the last we see of her is her in her cocoon, with Lennier watching on, his candle an echo of her Grey Council oath. Malari is also at a crossroads, choosing a path towards personal glory at a cost he had underestimated. Blood on his hands now. Both indebted to and indentured by Mr. Morden in ways uncertain. And we see that Mr. Morden is not alone on his travels. suggesting that he might not have been responsible for the damage done to Kosh's encounter suit in Signs and Portents. For the Narn, the year ends as it began, with attacks on the Centauri proving to have negative consequences for their standing. Sinclair could see it unravelling for them too. Too arrogant, too sure of putting one over on the Centauri, when they are simply farmers at heart. Now the shadows have come for them, and they are the ones licking their wounds. G'Kar knows something is very wrong, and is left to seek answers. Kosh is unusually involved in this episode, a sign and a portent of critical developments. He answers a question put to him by Lennier, reveals himself to Delenn to spur her to action, reminds Sinclair that he has forgotten something, and observes an advisory council meeting. And so it begins. The avalanche, perhaps. There are a lot of payoffs here, and a real sense that just as you were beginning to understand things, they all just got tipped on their head. Garibaldi out of commission, Delenn out of commission, G'Kar gone, Mollari unable to look at himself in the mirror for new reasons, perhaps. In amongst it all, a surgical attack by the Shadows eradicating the totality of a Narn military outpost and its defenders at the rate of knots, and some lovely interior shots of the station. So the effects guy is clearly working very, very hard. The Narn and Earthers finding common ground in their mutual pain, the former truly on the back foot, and the latter reeling from their changed reality and their inside knowledge of what might have happened on Earth Force One. This is an incredibly dense episode, so let me try and break it down a bit further in terms of its implications. The Centauri had effectively been ready to give a quadrant to the Narn, and were seemingly avoiding conflict. Mollari's union with Mr. Mordaunt upturned that policy stance in a stroke, with no one having a clue how Mollari might have done it. The Centauri suddenly ascendant, and Mr. Mordaunt and friends well pleased with that as an outcome. G'Kar flipping from in control to uncertain, even spooked, as a result of Mollari's new alliance, which of course he doesn't know about, having discounted his Centauri involvement. But his gut is telling him that something has changed, and he is pursuing his instincts by heading back to Narn. The Earth storyline is a genuine shock. We know there are various factions at play on Earth, Psychor, Earth First, others, but from what Garibaldi tells us about Devro's PPG, we know that the destruction of Earth Force One is likely to have been carried out by someone within the government, or someone well positioned to get access to high-level Earth Force equipment. We know that Ivanov's X had access to that sort of tech, but assassination of humans didn't seem their style. If it was that faction, what do they have to gain from Clark now being in power? Lots and lots of unanswered questions. Garibaldi is not back on his feet by the end of the episode, far from it, and his aide, the traitor, is keeping an eye on his recovery. Fortunately, the command staff and even Londo are keeping a vigil, as is Lennier, of course, who seems to have some idea of what is happening to Delenn, but is clearly concerned and troubled nonetheless. She's been building the machine for her metamorphosis for some time. We knew that she had the word Chrysalis on her mind, and as far back as Soul Hunter, we have known that she was planning something extraordinary. This, it would seem, was that something. Powered by a triluminary she is only just coming to possession of. Prophecy? In the midst of it all, unreadable as ever, Kosh. Watching, participating, prompting. And so it begins. But what is it? What are the implications of what's going on right now? We've gone from raiders being destroyed by Star Furies to orbital bombardments by ships that seem able to phase in and out of real space and presidential assassinations. Someone just pushed the plunger down and exploded the scope of Babylon 5 well beyond the corridors of the titular station. And of course that someone was J. Michael Straczynski. My feeling about this episode is that perhaps for the first time, if you hadn't seen previous episodes, you probably would have been lost. Yet, if you're coming in on a series in the last episode of a season, then you probably only have yourself to blame. And of course, it's not ignoring what's gone before, far from it. It just doesn't have time to give you a tidily packaged synopsis of the last 21 episodes. How could it? At times, it almost feels like it's going to trip over its own feet. The assault on Quadrant 37 is very, very fast. Maybe intentional, maybe just shortness of time. Garibaldi's exposition on jammers and triangulation devices is just a little too exposition-y. How's he even reading the various numbers and settings off those devices? Why would he know what they were? How did a lurker we've never met before put two and two together and seek to warn Mr. Garibaldi? I may have missed a detail